I just want to say thank you everybody for joining us today. I am Zoe Hubal, the president of the Anthropology Society at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And I am excited for today's presentation. I just want to say a few things before we get started. This meeting will be recorded just so everybody is aware, and it will be posted, the link and the recording on the internet, and I'll be able to email everybody that link after it's posted. Also, just as a reminder, please keep yourself muted until the very end. We will have a Q&A session. And at that point, you can definitely raise your hand, like use the little, the raise your hand option at the very bottom, or you can throw your questions into the chat. And feel free to do that during the presentation, and then I will be able to moderate that at the very end. But it looks like we have a good crowd today, so that's exciting. And you can go ahead with the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just move to sharing the screen. Great, thank you so much. Everyone can see, I think, the slideshow that I've got here. Yes, great. Now, just so everyone is aware, this is going to be about a half-hour long presentation, a little less, probably closer to like 20 minutes. And if anybody has any questions at any point, please feel free to raise your hand, or if I don't ask, if it's seems to be more time sensitive, like I'm moving away from the topic, feel free to like say something. I'm fine with pausing and addressing it. And there shouldn't be anything that's going to be too gross or triggering in this presentation. There is going to be a brief image of a dry skull, but there shouldn't be anything that makes anybody super squicked out, just so you're aware of that. So let me just start the presentation here. Oh dear. I'll just do it from this spot to not take up too much time. So let's talk about death. Everyone does it, but how is death conceptualized? Now, I don't mean death in scientific terms or personal terms, but how each culture answered the question of what happens next. Because when that question has a concrete answer, then popular ways of interacting with this next create a social space for death to exist in. We're going to look at 3 different time periods of the same region and examine how death worked within the social structure. Ancient Greece from roughly 700 BC to 400 CE, Serbia and Greece in the 17th and 18th centuries, and rural Greece in the 1970s. Now, there are several books that I'd recommend for further reading if you want to go in depth onto any of these topics, the list of which I'm happy to provide after this presentation. Now, first of all, what do we mean when we're talking about a social place for death? When the question of what happens after death is considered, all sorts of questions come up. Are punishments meted out in death? Are the good and bad members of society separated? Do the dead interact with the living in any way? Can the dead intercede on behalf of the living with the divine? In most cultures throughout history, the dead still had an active role in society, whether or not the dead were thought to inhabit a separate place or the confines of the burial ground. This meant that contacting the dead, either for your own personal ancestors or a famous healer or a prophet, was within the realm of possibility. In ancient Greece, this was something you could do either at a tomb or a nukomatienton. The dead were believed to have special knowledge of hidden things in general by virtue of being able to pool their collective knowledge. The future, the past, and the present were all topics which one would be able to consult the dead about. These consultations are a feature of the canon of classical Greek poetry, such as found in the Odyssey, as well as the scope of power held by Hypnos and his sons, particularly Morpheus. As the Nucomantianton was a gateway between this world and the next, and often situated within the mouth of caves, it was usually near a lake. The dead were thought to have a very straightforward journey to the afterlife. Hermes would escort the soul to the river Styx, where the dead would have to pay the ferry toll to continue onward. The successful payment meant that they could transition properly to the next world, and those who were not buried properly, someone who died at sea, someone who was traveling in the wilderness when they died, or someone whose body wasn't found after a war, they were doomed to wait on the shores of the river for eternity. And since this was a one-way trip, that meant that any special knowledge that the dead took with them was now tied to the underworld. The human body had a much more difficult time of getting to the realm of the dead than the human soul would, so they would need to go to a physical place that mimicked the metaphysical journey taken at death, where they could access a soul that wasn't able to fully make the journey in order to get at any sort of special knowledge the dead had. Several Nucomantianton existed throughout ancient Greece, and at these sites one would be able to find rituals very similar to those practiced at tombs to honor the dead. The key difference is that at a tomb, a rite would be made to honor a specific dead, which you'd often find at a festival. The tombs of the leaders of several mystery cults contain in their epitaph instructions on how to contact them. Pythagoreans were said to be especially chatty after death and often had such epitaphs on their tombs. Nucomantianton rites would be performed for the general dead, and they would be done as needed by the petitioner. When Odysseus needed to consult Tiresias and Agamemnon, he is said to travel to the land of departed spirits, which was a sort of Nucomantianton in order to do so. Once there, he digs a pit and pours 3 sets of libations into it, calling upon the dead to feast themselves. First, he pours milkatron, which is a mixture of milk and honey, then sweetened wine, and last water, all of which were topped with a sprinkling of barley. He completes these offerings by promising the dead, particularly Tiresias, sacrifices once he returns home, and then he drains the blood of 2 sheep into the pit. Odysseus then orders his living companions to burn the sheep offerings to Persephone and Hades, while he holds back the dead who he doesn't wish to speak to from drinking the offerings. Before Tiresias can get to the blood, however, one of the men who died in the Trojan War, who's named as Elphenor, cuts ahead of him and begs Odysseus for a proper funeral. So there's several key points which we can find here from this passage in the Odyssey. This part is known as the Nicaea, if anybody wants to find different translations of this. The dead can regain speech and their full memory after drinking an offering of blood, and a proper burial is the utmost importance for the dead to properly make the journey to the afterlife. While this passage from Homer is the first recorded instance of Greek necromancy, though it was often just called a psychogogia, it created the template which Greek poets followed up pretty much up until the fall of the Roman Empire. The dead will be very similar to how they were when they were alive, but they're going to have a heightened knowledge of all things, and they can be bribed with offerings to divulge this knowledge. There are a few key differences between what Odysseus demonstrates and what actual practice would have been, at least in late antiquity. One would not enact any rites at the Nucomantianton without the presence of a guiding oracle, and this was what And in fact, this was why going to the Nucomantianton was more convenient than just going to a tomb, because the oracle was already going to be there. After enacting the rites, they would not just sit and wait for the dead to show up. They would specifically do them at night, so they would fall asleep, and then in their dreams, the member of their dead would approach them. After enacting the rites, they would fall asleep. The oracle would then interpret whatever dreams they would have. Normally, however, they would assume that the dreams would just be direct communication between the two and no interpretation was needed. When Odysseus makes an effort to speak to the dead directly within the Odyssey, Tiresias is not the first one to approach him. It's a soldier who he apparently knew during the Trojan War. This This dead would have had the exact same knowledge as Tiresias because according to Greek thought at the time, all dead pretty much had the same knowledge. It was all pooled together. So it didn't matter which uh, ghost or spirit you contacted, they all would have the same knowledge. They were all omniscient. So it really wouldn't have made sense for Odysseus to speak to a specific one, except he just wanted to have um, the, the reassurance of speaking to a celebrity, I guess, is the best interpretation of that. The same as one would go on a quest to see Tiresias when Tiresias was alive. That's the most common interpretation. However, in actual practice, most Greeks, any old spirit who approached them during at the Nicomantianton would be as good as any other spirit. So it was commonly believed that the dead could speak to the living through dreams, and so the dead were able to send visions through the gods associated with sleep and dreaming. When examining the relationship the dead in ancient Greece have to dreams, we need to back up a moment and talk about how dreams were supposed to work in and of themselves. Well, Hypnos was the god of sleep specifically. His sons Morpheus, Phobator, Phantassus were directly responsible for manipulating dreams. And Hypnos' wife, Pathisia, was the goddess of hallucinations. While there are several stories that refer to the ability for the dead to speak in dreams to guide the living, the most important authors we can refer to about this are the poet Homer and the playwright Aeschylus, the philosopher Empedocles. Greek literature often of song. I refer you deceive men, bringing words that find no fulfillment. But those that come through the gate of song, through the gate of polished horn, bring true issues to pass when any mortal sees them. This was a play on words from Homer. As in Greek, the words keras mean horn, and krino means fulfill. Similarly, arapate means ivory, and arapato means deceive. This trope is echoed throughout later stories in which dreams figured, when Morpheus or sometimes Hermes would imitate the dead in order to speak to the living. This procedure was the same whether the dream was giving true or false information. The dead would not directly appear in the dream, though this doesn't seem to be a hard and fast rule when talking about the dreams had by petitioners in a psychagogia ritual. What is clearly established is that the dead were in a specific place which could be accessed through intermediaries and could be called upon for consultation. When we move away from ancient Greece into more recent history in the same area, we need to take into account secondary burial. What is secondary burial, and what is it for on a practical and social level? A secondary burial is when human remains are removed from where they were put close to their time of death and then moved to another location. Often, the second location is more communal, and the initial grave can be prepared for another resident. What we can theorize is that the development of these practices were influenced by limited space for burial, ideas of integrating the individual dead with the collective ancestors, the idea that the initial burial was necessary to some sort of transition of status within the afterlife, or a combination of any of these. The idea that the living could and must have a relationship with the dead in order to facilitate their movements in the afterlife is present in most religions. It is seen in the reciting of the mourner's Kaddish in synagogues and the lighting of commemorative candles in cathedrals. And within the context of secondary burial, the physical movement of the remains are linked to the movements of the soul within the afterlife, as well as the movements of social status. The secondary burial marks the end of the mourning period, and the family begins their transition from seclusion into the general fold of the community. The status from individual dead to collective ancestry allowed for ritualized version of the psychological event of the grieving process. What does this mean in the context of the journey taken from life to afterlife? By this time, the Greek Orthodox Church was in full control of the area, and though, as we will see that ideas of how the dead interacted with the living still carried across these two millennia. The dead inhabited a space separate from the living, and soon after their death, they can give instructions to the living through dreams to better facilitate this journey into the next world. The dead move from an individual person in society of the living to a part of another collective, and that is considered a whole. Like any journey, this is fraught with danger and requires very specific and correct preparation. The funeral is this preparation for the journey, so let's look at these dangers. What happens when that transition out of the social circle and into the ancestry is disrupted? What happens when the corpse becomes dangerous? Let's look at the early modern and Enlightenment era. The concept of a vampire is not a new one by any means. So let's focus on a specific aspect of the vampire myth. Between the 15th and 19th centuries across Eastern Europe, the dead were believed to have the ability to harm the living as revenants. An investigation of the bodies of a local churchyard would reveal the culprit, and a proper disposal would presumably put a stop to these troubles. Though written records show a variety of ways in which a revenant would harm the living and how to be rid of them, the physical characteristics of the revenant is consistent. Let's look at the damning criteria. According to the writings in the early 18th century by Dr. Klixinger, the grave of the revenant would look disturbed, with uneven soil and small holes leading down into the grave. The body itself, when the coffin had been unearthed and unopened, should look preserved and often plumper than it had been in life, with ruddy cheeks. Moreover, the body was often said to have some fresh blood coming from its orifices and to produce a very powerful stench. Noises were known to come from the body as it was dispatched. Other signs of vampire activity could be seen in signs of animal footprints coming from the grave. The corpse would often have chewed limbs and evidence of their hair or nails come growing after burial. Parts of the corpse might have come to the surface of the grave. And in most societies where there were vampire lore, secondary burial was not the general practice. This meant that the variety of physical processes that a body goes through in death were not reinforced through experience, but they were known through hearsay. If a body did not conform to the expected state of decay, it would be treated as a threat and ritualistically disposed of. A note on the animal footprints I mentioned. Often, the animating force behind a corpse was said to be demonic, which would be correlated to shapeshifting. There are other detailed accounts that we could bring to muster. In his written account on January 1701, Dr. Petanti Tournefort did not agree with the views of the townspeople. His description of them isn't particularly flattering. Let's read between the lines of the excerpt from Barber's book, which I believe I provided a PDF in the description of the presentation, pages 21 to 24. I'm just going to read a portion of it. Here we go. A peasant of Mykonos, naturally sullen and quarrelsome. He had been killed in the fields, no one knew by whom nor how. 2 days after he had been buried in a chapel in the town, it was bruited about that he had been seen walking during the night, taking long strides, that he had come into houses and turned over furniture, extinguished lamps, embraced people from behind, and played 1,000 roguish tricks. After a number of meetings, town leaders, priests, and monks concluded that it would be necessary to wait 9 days after the burial. On the 10th day, they said a mass in the chapel where the body lay in order to drive out the demon that they believed to be concealed in it. The body was disinterred after the mass, and they set about the task of tearing out its heart. The butcher of the town began by opening the belly rather than the chest. He rummaged about for a long time in the entrails. The heart was torn out to the admiration of all the bystanders, but the body stank so terribly that incense had to be burned. But the smoke, mixed with the exhalations of this carrion, did nothing but increase the stench, and it inflamed the minds of these poor people. They took it into their heads to say that the thick smoke was coming from the body, and we did not dare say it was the incense. People kept calling out nothing but Vrykolakas. The noise spread through the streets as if it were being roared. Several of the bystanders claimed that the blood of this unfortunate man was quite red, and the butcher swore that the body was still warm, from which they concluded that the deceased had the severe defect of not being quite dead, or to state it better, of letting himself be reanimated by the devil. And there arrived a crowd of people who professed loudly and plainly that they had plainly seen that the corpse had not become stiff when they had carried it from the fields to the church to be buried. I do not doubt that they would have maintained that the body did not stink if we had not been present. So stunned were these poor people from the business and so persuaded of the return of the dead. So what can we gather? First, there was a specific definition of a vampire, which was universally known among the townspeople, and which other parts of the account show that Tournefort was at least familiar with, even though he was not from that region. Next, there were rules and regulations regarding how to deal with the undead, and this might not be reflected in a formal legal code, but there was still a sense of due process and how things should be done. A group of men of both secular and religious backgrounds convened in response to the reported disturbances and agreed to proceed with a specific length of time, 9 days to be exact. From this account, it seems as if the town had gathered for this exhumation. The butcher was the one to actually cut up the corpse, and it was needed in order to extract the heart of the dead man. Now, while de Tournefort did not say he saw what those who were with him saw, we can surmise that there was a rough rubric for how to determine there was a vampire at this time. The billowing smoke, which the town people said came from the corpse, is a common folkloric indication of infernal activity, which one aspect can be said could either be supposed from animated because of demonic activity or from some sort of other similar reason. Also, those who interacted with the corpse claimed that it was warm and full of running fresh blood, despite the doctor's obvious protests. So the two contemporary cases of de Tournefort and Klickstinger explain the space that the undead, the dangerous dead, inhabited in society. So just as filth is matter out of place, such as dirt on the kitchen table instead of out in the garden, the undead are dangerous because they are people who are out of place. They have been removed from general society by death, yet instead of being among the ancestors, they linger in the wrong social circle. The undead outcast can be determined through the rubric of criteria, such as who died immediately before the disturbances started, and whose grave shows signs of being disturbed, and of course, who the locals have claimed to have seen. A corpse who did not completely fit the description might instead be another victim of the actual vampire. But let's get back to that bit at the beginning of de Tournefort's account. A peasant of Mykonos, naturally sullen and quarrelsome, he had been killed in the fields, no one knew whom nor how. Of course, those who were accused of vampirism and death had been at the fringes of society and life. Those who lived alone, those who often argued with others, or strangers, such as traveling merchants and soldiers who had died near the town, but were not native to it. If we look back 2,200 years prior to de Tournefort's account, staying in Greece but turning back to ancient times, we can see evidence of the dead disturbing the living as well. Battlefields were thought to be especially haunted, and the restless dead would hassle the people of nearby towns. Some particularly famous battlefields were thought to be regularly have their dead reappear, and their appearance could help make predictions about local weather patterns. But we're more concerned about the dead harassing the living and how this reflects on their social role. The sites of Marathon and Troy were also the sites for exorcisms, where the restless dead took possession of the locals. And just as the tombs of famous warriors became cult sites of hero worship, they were also blamed for drought and the deaths of livestock. The corpse became dangerous when its place in society, who would mourn it, who would ensure proper rituals, was not properly defined. The vampire was a candidate for blame by virtue of being outside the prescribed role for a corpse. However, it can be argued that the procedures surrounding the disposal of a vampire do in fact point to a prescribed role. So let's explore that. During the mourning period, the families, and to a lesser extent communities' actions, can dictate the fate of the soul of the deceased. The body should be burned or buried or otherwise disposed of properly. If it was just chucked out with the garbage, there would be a great deal of upset, and it would follow that the soul of the person would be upset or somehow harmed from such disrespect to skirting this procedure. This is how, according to folklore of all stripes, one gets hauntings. Doing everything possible during the mourning period to ensure that the soul has an easy path to a good place in the afterlife, therefore both good behavior for the living relatives and measurable by the perceived activity or lack thereof of the deceased. There is a modern case where, in fact, we can see this illustrated. In the 1970s, in the rural Greek town of Potamia, it was the subject of an in-depth anthropological study by Dansforth. Intimate pictures were taken alongside the study by a native to Mesopotamia, Alexander Tsarias. In these deeply conservative Eastern Orthodox rural societies, the mourning period begins with illness and ends with the secondary burial. Often, this period stretches for 5 years. The first burial starts a period of time where the deceased is still in contact with their friends and relatives as they make their way to the afterlife. This communication occurs through dreams and concerns how the living can facilitate the dead's easy entry into heaven. Whether conducting unfinished business or tending to the grave in a particular way, these instructions are carried out as quickly as possible by the female relatives who come daily to wash the grave markers and replenish the candles and food offerings. How does this affect the dead? According to tradition, the likelihood of someone going to heaven or hell is shown in how laborious their final breaths are. The more difficult the breathing, the more likely the soul is destined to go to hell. The ultimate fate of the souls of the dead can be influenced by the prayers and good deeds of their living relatives. This is common with several other branches of Christianity. However, within this specific tradition, the magnitude of the task is more clearly defined. What we are most concerned about today is secondary burial. All of the laments and offerings done while the body is in the ground are meant to both comfort and save a person's soul. The success of these efforts is literally seen during the secondary burial. These events are open to the community at large and are often treated as a social requirement by women who are in mourning or who have been recently in mourning. It is an opportunity for the women of the town to reinforce the social bonds forged through the experience of mourning and caring for graves. The body is dug up, the bones are recovered, and the skull is particularly important, and it is passed around and kissed and spoken to as if it were the person themselves. The color and decomposition are the important factors here. If the bones are completely white with no traces of flesh on them, the soul of the deceased is considered to have made it to heaven. However, uh, uh, sorry, if there are traces of flesh or discolored bones, those are signs that the soul has been condemned. This can be due either to the deeds of the person themselves or of another relative who has passed on their sins to this person. The exact culprit is determined in the court of public opinion, often at the actual event of the secondary burial. These bones, once collected, are wrapped in a cloth and placed in a smaller vessel, such as a metal box or a briefcase, and then that container is placed in the community ossuary. The now empty grave is disassembled and the earth is turned over in preparation for the next occupant. When discussing how human remains are treated, one must consider the concepts of cleanliness within the context of the society in question. The clean white bones, which are required as proof that the soul has indeed made the transition into heaven, are not the bleached, clean bones one would find in, say, the modern science lab. What is being looked for is the complete separation of bone from physical traces of the person who they were. This goes back to what we discussed earlier about the transition from individual member of society to a part of the general laity, general ancestry, pardon me. So let's lay out our three examples here and see how the societal role of the dead can be looked at different periods of time. In ancient Greece, the dead were a knowledge resource which could be accessed through ritual process or who might contact the living through dreams with important messages. All bribery and manipulation concerned the treatment of the remains and the respects due to the corpse in its disposal. Often a ghost would be helpful in exchange for proper burial, and this proper burial is what prevented them from getting to the afterlife and allowed them to be contacted through the Nucamateanon in the first place. We now see how this continues into the modern age with the Vrykolocaust. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Vrykolocaust is a supernatural phenomenon which has rules and regulations already well in place to contain and dispatch it, all of which are meant to make the body disposal more secure. By the 1970s, the dead still communicate freely with the living, and again, they do so in order to make sure their physical remains are properly treated. Moreover, in all of these cases, there is a concept of shared sins, where misdeeds of some family members can affect other family members in a ripple effect. This is a trope common to the literature of ancient Greece, with the Oresteia trilogy being one of the better known examples. Contemporary versions of this concept are alive and well at funerals, with the explanation for some damning flesh clinging onto the bones of the dead might be some trespass by another member of the family. The dead of Greece and the surrounding area haven't had their journey to the afterlife changed all that much. The time immediately after death, when their memory is still fresh in the minds of their peers and their family was still in mourning, was particularly volatile. This was when the dead were trying to get into whatever conventional version of paradise, and they relied very heavily on the living to get there. Visiting the living through dreams and as a ghost is the best way to rectify poorly observed grave rites and to micromanage their own burial. If something was seriously amiss, the body itself might reanimate to some degree. This wrongness surrounding the dead can often relate back to public opinion and social status. When discussing how the dead are remembered by their peers, the body itself and the circumstances of death can and will be influenced by local folklore. The fate of the soul is not an unknowable thing and dependent on faith and the social systems we have discussed, but are matters of concrete facts which can be determined through observable features of the corpse, as well as reported activity such as hauntings. Just as finding signs of life in a corpse indicates a vampire, signs of the materials of the body clinging literally to the skeleton in bits of flesh indicates the soul having an incomplete or difficult transition to the next stage of its journey. The deeds of the dead, as well as their family, are at fault and influences their position in the eyes of their peers. In these cultures, the physical appearance of the corpse is a means of divining the moral health of these members of society. Stop sharing there.
I have a question. I'm sorry. Are you through with the
Yes, I'm
presentation?
good.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt. So with
No,
the
it's okay.
whole with the second burial ceremony, if it is like if the remains were determined to be like condemned, how you said, what is like I guess the stigma around like how the or even like the reality, like how those families deal with that, like the living members of that family. Like, can you go into detail about that? That's fascinating.
Yes. So I'm assuming that you're referring to modern day rural Greece.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to be relying very strongly on the study by Dan Forth, which I actually do have on my shelf right here. So, in fact, the most common practice is, as I said, to determine in the court of public opinion or gossip at the secondary burial why there are bits of flesh still clinging to the skeleton. So, who could it have been that was so awful that this person is now condemned to hell? And that might not be a permanent state. This might be more of a purgatory thing, depending on the person. So, one of the people who is being studied, whose funeral was being attended during this study, was in fact a young woman who was known as who was very well liked and was considered to be a very good and righteous person. And there were bits of discoloration and bits of her clothing still attached to her body when it was uncovered 5 years later for the secondary burial. And it was generally assumed by people who were there at the second funeral that it was a great uncle, if I remember correctly, who had been like um, someone's like a greedy landlord type figure who just kind of like cheated a tenant out of some money, and how his bad behavior condemned her, and that essentially through um, like the mother was going to have to do like extra good deeds, and like her cousins and living relatives were going to have to do extra good deeds to try and like help balance that out. It was assumed that she was paying the price for her relatives um, bad bad judgment, and that was just further proof that the family hadn't made up for this relative yet. So it's almost like there was a group karma that that everyone kind of had to balance.
That's
Did
so
I answer?
fascinating. So would you go as far to say I don't know much about like religious anthropology and stuff and burial rituals and whatnot. I know a little bit, but um as far as like the moral compass that's associated with that tradition, would you say that that's like I guess it has meaning, and it helps to guide like the family with, you know, their morals or ethics in that culture.
I definitely think it does, and there is actually a lot of literature on this concept within ancient Greek literature because this is a very common trope in Greek tragedy. I did mention the Orpheus in particular because there is the idea of one person like does something wrong, and then that just passed down the line forever and ever until the gods intervene and were like, okay, you've suffered enough. Um, so it's kind of like a collectivism, which had been a thing in pretty much every culture until very, very recently, where your actions aren't just your own. Everyone has to deal with them. So you can't just, act all willy nilly as if you're a single entity. Um, I hate to use that phrase that has become such a joke, but we live in a society. We're not just single people. Everything we do impacts everyone around us. You can't just, walk down the street and punch somebody because A, that's rude and you should probably get punched back. But B, people are then going to also be like, turn to like your mother and be like, your kid's just going around punching people, just to make a small version of that, that comment. So it's it's everybody's problem if you're going to not behave like a member of the group.
I feel like, especially in today's modern societies, and I mean, like immediately, like I speak for like, you know, my community and like my society and like the American culture and stuff. We could definitely take a note from more of the traditional route. But awesome. How did you get into this? This is so fascinating. This topic, like your interest. Did you just like fall into it?
Oh, I'm just very interested in death, in all the various forms of what death means within a culture and how it's a universal experience. Everybody does it, and everyone has to deal with it in some way or another. And the ways in which um, either we come up with ways to conceptualize it or prepare for it, um, or just mythologize it is fascinating. And not just the ways that there are universal means of mythologizing and dealing with death, but also the unique ways in which people conceptualize the whole what happens next question.
That's so awesome. So what's I guess what's your next step with your current research?
Well, right now I'm working on my thesis project, which is actually how contemporary pagans are um, changed, how contemporary pagans during the past year of quarantines and lockdowns altered their ritual practices. Just because so much of contemporary paganism is communal. And I had been focusing specifically on contemporary paganism and funerary ritual. So there is definitely a big focus on that within my work, but and I'm probably going to turn back to that to some degree once my thesis study has been completed.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions for Milo? You can either unmute yourself, raise your hand, or throw the question into the chat. I see Renee has a question. You can go ahead, Renee. Renee is like a huge fan of like phenology and like paganism and all that. So I'm excited. Okay.
Do you happen to have any general opinions on how neo-pagan groups interact in an overwhelmingly anti-pagan society? Um, well, it's very interesting because in terms of an overwhelmingly anti-pagan society, It really does depend on your perspective. I would say in the United States specifically, it is an extremely puritanical society, um, which is starkly different from other places that I've looked at and I've studied. If you're looking at contemporary paganism in Western Europe, it's very different from how it looks like on the East Coast of the United States, or how it looks like in the West Coast of Canada, or how it looks like in different parts of um, even just Eastern Europe. But you do also have to think about what your definition of pagan is there. I'm very a big sticking point for me is what the definition of neo-paganism is, because there is and there should be a huge focus on the movement of reclaiming indigenous religion and indigenous folklore publicly, within Latin America, within people of African descent, and happily there's a huge movement in the southern United States of people who are African American who are kind of promoting and reclaiming their heritage. And a lot of people up until maybe like 10, 20 years ago would have seen that as pagan, would have taken a look at hoodoo and voodoo and said, oh, this is paganism. But is it? Because it's in some ways it's syncretic religion, because it is kind of taking Yoruba and Yoban tradition and grafting it onto Roman Catholicism, but also it's morphed into its own thing, and also it's not strictly an African American thing. And yes, Wiccanism is very different because um, Renee just made a comment, popular contemplative Wicca versus Haitian voodoo. Yes, so there is Wiccanism, and Wicca does take a lot of things from indigenous Native American religions, which is its own interesting thing. In the United States, there is a weird blend between Gardenian Wiccanism, which is something you'd find definitely in Western Europe, particularly in England and France, and that is a movement that started in very much the 1920s. You'll see a huge movement of Gardenian Wicca. It had a giant boom in the 80s, but it definitely had like its start in like the World War One 1920s era. Um, so that is its own thing, and it's not. It doesn't have as much pushback as you'd think in places such as England. Um, in the United States, even there's a lot of places where it's just, people might just go like, oh, they're just, hippy dippy, crunchy, um, earth mothery, they like crystals kind of a thing. But there's also people who are, Methodist, and they also, have an earth mother pendant, and they like, dance barefoot out in the rain, and they pray, and they like to, make a blessing towards, like they like to pray to this tree, whenever they're menstruating. There's such a huge spectrum of paganism, especially in the United States, that you can't really define pagan anymore, because there, in the past 100 years, it's been such a sliding scale, um, and there's so many weird blurred lines, especially as people are trying to like find where in their heritage their own indigenous religion is, which I think is both good and bad, because there's also a lot of people who have a strictly white heritage who are also like, well, where is, like, I see all this fun and interesting thing that I really love and admire that my friends are doing, where they're reclaiming their heritage. Can I help them celebrate that without stepping on other people's toes? So you find people that are learning about, like, going to their reservations and participating in other people's, celebrations, and then they're taking home, you know other people, things that they've gotten from their friends, hang it up on their wall. People then grow up with, a dream catcher that they got from their not blood uncle. And where does that fit into their belief system? So there's so many strange crossovers, and it comes to it's a very weird territory to say what's pagan, what's anti-pagan, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And we're in a fantastic turning point there, where we're trying to define what isn't okay, what isn't yours, and I don't know what I would call anti-pagan anymore. Is where I'm trying to go with this.
That's really fascinating. I liked what you had to say about that personally. I wish I knew more um, on that topic. Sabrina has a little comment. So as we move forward, there is a homogenization of practice and belief systems? Question mark.
Um, yes, I would say we are. I think that there was a big homogenization period that we're starting to come out of right now. Um, there has been a lot of studies recently about how everyone kind of goes through a rebellious phase in when they're like a teenager and in their 20s where they discover witchcraft, especially in predominantly Christian societies like in Western Europe and in the United States, where that just might be a thing where it's kind of like trying to find your own power, and that kind of leads towards a sort of religious homogenization because people get exposed to that. But that is a double-edged sword because that will also create evangelicalism in some ways. So we're at a turning point where there was a huge boom in homogenization, partially because of access to information with the internet. And so we're at a who knows what's next point, really. Oh, there is a big boom in syncretic religions right now, though, where people are realizing, um, like like the hypothetical person I just mentioned, who they have the close family friend who gave them a gift from the reservation that's always hung up on their wall, and they're realizing, well, this might not be my culture, but I am Italian and Stregheria is a thing. So I can go and turn a statue of St. Anthony upside down in the backyard whenever I lose my car keys. Or I can, um, wear a bit of red um, horn on my neck to, protect me against the evil eye. Little things like that are starting to come back in a new and interesting way. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
sorry, I had a question.
yeah.
So in the Odysseus portion, like the early ancient Greece,
Yeah.
so there's that random soldier that came back after Odysseus did the ritual, and you're going on to say like how those souls had to wait at the shore for eternity and they really couldn't go anywhere. Um, However, it didn't seem to me like what I think the crux with the question is like what was the appeal of going to the ancient Grecan underworld? If they could just do all the same things just on this eternal shore that they could do or seem to do like not in the underworld.
Well, it's kind of that it wasn't that they could do the same thing in the underworld. If you're stuck there on the shore, it's kind of like it was thought that you didn't belong anywhere. You were just stuck in the wild. And this was an era where like it was extremely dangerous to be caught in between towns. There wasn't really any. If you were in a kind of a nowhere zone, there was wolves. You were exposed to the elements. There was just kind of it was just kind of like a rocky, foresty area where there were just wild animals. So if you're just kind of stuck on a riverbank with a bunch of people who also had nowhere to go, you were just exposed to the, metaphysical element, so to speak, waiting for someone, among the living to pay your way across the ferry. So you wouldn't be, so you would then actually be somewhere, which was actually supposed to be like just a big nice field for in a lot of interpretations of it, which is it wasn't just you were hanging out by a river as opposed to hanging out in a field. There was supposed to be an element of danger.
And then so I just have three questions. I'm not taking up any time.
That's fine.
And then moving on to the 18th century with the vampires. A bit simpler. How deep did they tend to bury the bodies? Where if like the wild animals and stuff are getting at them, to signify vampire signs. And then the other one was like how did they come to like no, okay, this is the thing. Like these are all the signs that a vampire's around. Like how did they come into that rather than or find that process that this is how they determine it rather than like it's just suddenly be there. Like I'm asking more about the journey to that uh
Yeah.
education, I guess.
For Klicksinger's kind of like a bullet point checklist of what makes a vampire. Um, well, it didn't have to hit all the marks. It just kind of had to be most of those or definitely different. Also, it could have just been like, oh, it's one of these and we don't like this guy. It definitely was this one. Um, Also, you do have to keep in mind that there was no standard procedure for burying somebody. Often they wouldn't even get a coffin. They would just dig a hole deep enough, quote unquote. They'd be wrapped in their shroud and they would be chucked in the hole. Um, as well as the fact that a lot of burial places were very transient. The burial ground is different from the cemetery. It wasn't until I want to say the 19th century was really the age of the cemetery. Up until that point, a burial ground was kind of a space that was set aside. It was considered holy ground where the dead can go. And it was that space for all time. So that was a limited amount of space where they'd chuck the bodies and there would be a grave marker, but it wasn't a permanent marker and you might not even get one. So over time, obviously, the body would decompose and then new bodies would go in there and there might be bits of bone that were, moved around over time. And you, only so long as you had relatives that were able to remember where your body were, would that area be undisturbed because people were going there to pay respects if they felt like going there to pay respects, which was especially, you know, um, that change from burial ground to cemetery was especially noticeable in England and France because there was a huge fashionable trend of like, oh, well, we want to have a big stone monument or oh, we want specific plants here and there. So that's a whole huge other discussion about how that changed. Um, did you have one other question? Because I do see another one in the chat and I want to address
Uh,
both.
yeah, I think yeah, because the one I was asking was more like how did they come to determine like they determined like the guy was a vampire, right? But how did they determine that
Yes.
these are the steps or not or again not the scientific process? But how did they know that as vampires is this, that and the third, and that was how they got the list, not how they determined the vampire.
Well, there was actually a scientific thought process to this because during life, the person was probably going to be underfed. They'd probably look, a little pale. They didn't have, like a nice pampered life. They probably looked pretty underfed and worn down. But in death, you're very likely going to swell and, discolor. You're probably going to get a little purple and or ruddy as you decompose. And as the body swells up, you're going to look like, you're well fed and plump. And if they happen to open the grave at the right time, they would look much better fed than they ever did when they were alive. So that's one way. And also, if the body is just wrapped in a sheet and not dug very deep, because you don't have all that much time to bury somebody if you got to get back to the fields or whatever you have to do that day. Um, the wild animals might come by and dig in, so there will be holes in the ground, or there will be animal footprints, or like the arm might be dragged up. So there are all sorts of reasons to make it look like someone clawed their way out of the grave and turned into a wolf and wandered off.
Just thank you. That was it.
Oh, sure. And there was also in the chat appreciation versus appropriation, belief system through true spiritual affinity, or is it the appearance of it? And either way, who decides which is which? I think that spiritual affinity versus aesthetic, the whole culture vulture thing, I really think that's a personal thing, and no one can really determine how much you truly believe something. I think that also is a big part of the poor faith argument. A lot of people who are a lot of people who are I'm blanking out on the name, someone who doesn't believe in religion. I feel sorry. Um, Atheists. Yes, sorry, thank you. The poor faith argument that an atheist might have against somebody who is like very passionately a believer, that like, oh, you're just believing this for brownie points, or just because you're scared and you want to like, hedge your bets. Um, so I don't know if you can really make that decision for somebody else, in terms of spiritual affinity. But I do think that because so many people are trying to do the work of what is my cultural heritage and what is the religious heritage that I actually have a right to, um, I think that that is awesome. That's also very complicated because nobody, how many people are one heritage anymore? That's like not even a thing, for so many people that, the appreciation versus appropriation thing even gets a little muddy there.
I find that a very like hot topic, um like studying anthropology and being an anthropologist, the appreciation versus appropriation. And I find it interesting the amount of blame that's placed from one group or one person to another, at least what I've witnessed, not from like the academic side or the educational side, like, observing how different populations deal with that argument, like what we're seeing, and documenting. But I would love to see like more education on that aspect, because like you said, it's like we can't dictate how much another person believes in something. That's not our place. Like ideologically, like we have to respect them. And so like I feel like if there was some sort of system, more like stewardship or something along those lines, I feel like we could all like appreciate each other's like spirituality, when it comes down to it. But anyway, okay. Does anybody
Yeah.
else have any last
And
minute
I think that just
questions?
one thing that
Oh,
is,
sorry, you can go ahead.
I was just gonna say the one, just the one parting statement I would say is something that is, I wish that was more universal, that I find throughout, studying thanatology and just death studies is, um, it's okay to not know. That I think causes a lot of infighting between, um, different religions and just like scientific thought versus theological thought. And what makes a lot of people have a lot of arguments is like, well, create like the burden of proof and just, well, you have to have a definitive answer. And for a lot of things, yes, you should have a definitive answer about how certain things work and how, certain things are beneficial. But like your answer to like what happens after death, or, why does this ritual like work for you, or why should I follow, my mother's heritage religion or my father's heritage religion. You don't need to have an answer for that. All these sort of metaphysical things, all these spiritual things, they don't need to have an answer, and it's okay to also not have a definition between something like, that is supposed to be spiritual. Things don't need to have a scientific, backing if they're not meant to be quantifiable.
I absolutely agree with that. My whole thing with, um, I guess, with my future and how I conduct, you know, my research and what I do, even on like a daily basis, it's all about like educational outreach and how we can kind of we can affirm, you know, these notions of it's okay not to know, and it's also okay to ask questions, and it's okay to take things, you know, either seeing them in a rational light or an emotional light. It's all okay, you know, we're just humans, and like we're just like this big bundle of nerves and energy, you know. And I definitely agree with that. It's not everything needs to be quantified, you know. And as social scientists, that's, we're all about like the qualitative measures, you know. But thank you so much for this presentation. I definitely learned a lot, and I hope everybody that attended today learned something too. We definitely had a really good discussion. Um, yeah, if nobody else has any last minute questions, I think we are good to go and meeting adjourned. Thank you so much, Milo.
Absolutely.